you have to give yourself permission to write shit. Because if you're not willing to write imperfectly, you're never going to get to the end.
I hope writers take this to heart. It is such a release of pressure and stress if you just allow yourself to write a shitty first draft. Welcome to the Scriptcake podcast. This week, I'm honored to have Lisanne Sartor, an award-winning filmmaker whose films have screened in over 50 film festivals, including the Telluride Film Festival and the American Pavilion at Cannes. She graduated from Yale University. That means she's smart, people. Before moving to LA and entering the Directors Guild of America training program, she later received her MFA in screenwriting from UCLA, where she won numerous awards, including the Samuel Goldwyn Award. Her screenplay Cleaverville was produced and aired on the Lifetime Network. She teaches screenwriting at UCLA, AFI, and Stevens College, and is the board president of the Cinestory Foundation, a screenwriting nonprofit that is dedicated to nurturing new screenwriting talent through writers' retreats and fellowships. Welcome to the Scriptcake podcast.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for asking me.
No, I'm very excited to have you here. I've known Lisanne a little bit for a couple of years. We had a class together one time, and started following her and learning about all the amazing things that she's done. And what I would like to do is start from, how did you get from Yale to entering the DGA? How does that happen?
Oh my God. My father had the same question. Oh my God. He literally had my sister. I have a twin sister, and he had us apply to undergrad as chemical engineering majors. I mean, like literally so not me.
Let me interject here. I am 21 credits away from a civil engineering degree myself.
Really?
So having Indian parents, there's only a few majors that you're allowed to go into. And so I was on that path myself, but to his credit, my father's the one that forced me to change my major.
Really?
Yeah. We'll get into that.
That's impressive. Yeah, well, you were not getting into that another time. Well, my dad literally saw my chemistry grades because I like hated it. And like I wasn't college material when it came to science classes. And he saw my grades, got the first C's in my life. And he's like, okay, that was my freshman year, my first semester. And he's like, that's it. You don't have to do it. But there wasn't any filmmaking at Yale, supposedly. I mean, people did make films, but there weren't really filmmaking classes. There were film criticism classes there. But I knew somebody that was a screenwriting major. He was, my sophomore year, he lived the floor above me. And I thought, oh, people do this. Mm-hmm. And then I remember hearing about Rob Long, and I forget his writing partner's name, who went on literally right out of Yale. They went on, or I don't know if it was right out of Yale, but they went on and wrote for Cheers for years and had this big career. He was only a few years ahead of me at Yale. And so all of a sudden I was like, oh, people do this. And because it really wasn't in my purview. So I went to Italy after college and I studied photography and art. And I came home and I was like, all right, I'm saving money. I'm going to save money for a year. And I worked for a state senator for a year, which was fun and interesting and lots of fodder for lots of writing. And I saved and I moved out here because I knew I wanted to work in the industry. I didn't really know how I was going to get there, but I knew I wanted to write and I wanted to direct. And I came out, and this was such a long time ago that the Hollywood Reporter and Variety were still coming out in paper. And you would go, was it once a week? And all of the productions that were either in prep or in production would list themselves. And so I just started sending out resumes, and I happened to get a job as an assistant production coordinator on a movie called Dolly Dearest. Like I was so green that I walked into the interview in a suit and heels. Yeah, you clearly know what I'm talking about. And I was mortified. But, I ended up getting the job and did 2 years of production. And I knew that I didn't want to be in the production office. So, and I wanted to be on set. So I heard about the DGA training program and thought, oh, let me see if I can get into that. And it's one of those things where I think at that point, 4,000 to 5,000 people were applying, and then you had to go take this. I like to say that it was, part of the testing, I think it was an MMPR, which is testing for psychosis, I believe. I can't remember, but it's a psychological test. And I was saying they were testing to keep the psychos in the program. I just kept going through each phase and thinking, I'm not going to make it to the next phase. And I would make it to the next phase. So I did that for a year and 10 months because there were no strikes, and you would work straight through. And I ended up being an assistant director. And you go from, back then it was $100 a week, literally. So you were making, or was it $400 a week? It was crazy. It was crazy low. I think you started out, I'm sorry, at $250 a week, and then you got a $50 raise every 100 days because you had to work 400 days. So you went from making, at the end of it, for me, it was $400 a week to making $3,000 a week. And I thought, okay, I have to do this. I got into the guild right away, and it was miserable. I mean, I knew it was miserable from the beginning, but I thought, I cannot do this forever. So I would think I was an AD for a total of 6 to 8 years, but I knew I wanted to write. And what was good about it is by the end, I took a job on The Single Guy, which was a multi-camera show. So it was only shooting 2 days a week. And that enabled me to write. And so from there, I just was writing and writing and writing and writing. And I applied to grad school and got in. Well, that's not true. I applied to grad school, didn't get in the first time around to UCLA, but I got into the very first year of the professional program. And which I loved. I mean, I had a couple of really fantastic people teach me, and one of them was Ed Solomon, who's an amazing screenwriter. And so he ended up writing me a recommendation, which I think really helped me. But I also learned a lot from him about writing. And I remember the script I was writing in his class, I went to Italy on my own for a couple of weeks, and I had to finish it while I was there. So I was handwriting the script. And it was fascinating how differently I thought when I was handwriting. And so that stayed with me all these years. Like, if I really get stuck, I'll start handwriting.
What's the difference?
You process differently when you write by hand, because it's a tactile process as opposed, so you're, and it's true when you do art too, because I was a fine arts major for part of my college years. And I drew and sculpted for years. And so when you're doing something like that by hand, as opposed to doing it digitally, it's a completely different process. And you are able to access parts of your brain that you don't access when you're typing on a computer or when you're making digital art. It's really interesting.
It is interesting.
I think that's why the artist way, why morning pages worked so well for so many people, because you're handwriting those pages mostly. I think a lot of people handwrite anyway, and you are able to access just an enormous wealth of stuff you don't really know is there.
I remember, I'm gonna age myself here, back in the 80s when I was in college and got my first computer, a Commodore 64, if you remember those. In class, they would teach us to handwrite our papers and then type them into the computer.
Exactly. Oh yeah, that's what I used to do. Exactly.
And it never made sense to me. I'm like, why am I writing it and then rewriting it? So I would just write it in the computer, and then I would edit it in the computer, and it would move on. And I've always been that way. So I haven't handwritten anything in years. I should give that a shot.
It's really interesting. I mean, I remember I too got my first computer in college when the first Mac came out, and I would handwrite my papers and then type them in. And then sophomore year, I did not do that and lost 18 pages of a paper that was due the next day. So, oh yeah, it was bad.
I had a paper I was co-writing with a friend of mine. He came over, and that computer was connected to our light switch.
Oh no.
Yeah, and we went out to get some dinner, and he hit the light switch, and it killed probably 10 or 15 pages because we hadn't saved it yet, because it was still new back then. We didn't have
exactly. You didn't think to save every 5-10 minutes or whatever. There was no auto save. It was nuts. But once I did start, and I still will write on the computer most of the time. But like I said, when I get stuck, or when I'm at the beginning of something, like I keep these journals, and I'm not really great at journaling. I've never enjoyed it. But when I'm starting a project, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll take an idea and I'll handwrite everything I can think about the story. And then the next day I'll go back to it and I'll make notes, at the end. But the next day I'll go back, and whatever notes I've taken about or what's occurred to me during the rest of the day, because I'll try to take a long walk or whatever, because that's also how I process what I've written. And whatever comes to me during that downtime, I'll then write that out. And then I'll rewrite the whole story based on those new changes and see how that changes everything. But that's the beginning of the script for me, especially, like I said, if I'm stuck. And then I'll type that stuff in. And then it changes even from there, because typing it in for me is another way to rewrite, which is I definitely noticed, like, I'll still print out a script and I'll handwrite all sorts of notes all over it.
Yeah, I will do that
and
for
type
sure.
those in. Yeah.
Not recently, maybe a couple years ago, I got this thing called the Remarkable. Are you familiar with that tablet?
Oh, I don't know. I'm
So
gonna
it's
look
called the
again.
Remarkable, and basically it's like an iPad, except you don't have internet access and there's no gaming functions.
Kevin.
And then the pen that they've designed actually feels like a pencil on paper.
Oh,
And so whenever I'm grading students' projects, they send it to me in a PDF. I'll load it in. I'll just handwrite all my notes on it and I'll email it directly back to them. But I can't do anything else. I can't sit there and, let me check my email or whatever.
yeah,
It doesn't
exactly.
allow you to do. The only thing you can do is email a file to somebody, and that's
But
pretty.
clearly, your handwriting is still legible because when I was doing that with students, I would actually have to be so careful because my handwriting's gotten so bad. Oh my God. Yeah.
I think my students would agree with you. They what is this? What does that say? And the worst is when you can't read your own handwriting and you
Oh
can't.
my God. Yeah. Yeah,
But
definitely.
I use it for myself too whenever I'm making notes or when I'm outlining something. And the cool thing is it's a pad that basically never runs out of paper. You can just keep everything in it.
That's great. I'm gonna get one of those actually. That sounds
And
great.
it also has one of those things where you write something and you hit a button and it just turns it into text.
Oh my
It
God.
doesn't convert it because it'll learn the way that you write. But yeah, for the writers out there, the Remarkable pad it is remarkable. I really enjoy it. So I got one for my daughter for her school as well. So
Oh, you just gave me an idea. For my one of my kids is a writer, the other one's an artist.
ah,
So yeah, it's always like, oh, what can I get them? I have no clue.
yeah,
That's gonna be,
my mom used to say one artist in the family is too many.
oh my God. Yeah, it kind of freaks my husband out because both of his parents were painters and
Oh,
he's a financial advisor.
ah,
Uh-huh.
skips a generation.
Well, he actually had the skill and the ability, but he saw how his parents struggled. His mother actually did hit it and become a very, very big artist, but his dad did not like the New York art scene. But he really watched them struggle and decided he did not want that.
It's tough. And being the arts myself, it's not a cakewalk every day.
No, not at all. And that's what I'm trying to impress on our kids. And they get that. They definitely get that. But when you're young like that, like 20 and 22, it just seems like everything is possible.
It is.
And I
It
think
is. It is possible at 20 and 22.
and exactly. And you lose a little bit of that as you get older. I mean, you start to realize, well, there's other stuff I got to do.
If there was a way to get that back, I would take that pill.
Me
But
too,
getting back on track,
for sure.
um, handwriting and typing in, you're talking about that process, and you are about to get into UCLA at this point, right?
Um, so I was handwriting. Oh yeah, so I handwrote that thing, and yeah, I remember getting the call because they don't back then. What they did is anyway, it doesn't matter how I got in, but I got in, and I loved it because, and I stayed. They would only let you stay 10 semesters. It's supposed to be a 2-year program. I stayed 10 semesters or quarters, actually, not semesters. And I wrote 9 scripts in 10 quarters because the 434 there, you have to finish a draft. Is
Lou Hunter, right?
Lou Hunter and Richard
Yeah.
Walton. I worked for Richard for 2.5 years while I was there. Um, Linda Voorhees, that's where I met her. That's where I met Tim Alba. I mean, there's just such an amazing group of people that are still there.
Yeah,
And
Linda's where we met actually.
yeah,
We
yeah,
met
yeah,
through Linda. Yeah.
exactly. And Linda's terrific. She
Yeah.
actually, I took her class twice while I was there, while I was at UCLA, because she's so good with structure. And UCLA, what I loved about it, because I applied to NYU, AFI, USC, and UCLA, and UCLA is the one I wanted to go to because I knew that that's where you could write more than, because I think at the time USC was writing 2 scripts. I don't remember how many AFI were, but UCLA was the only one where you could write up to like 9 scripts or 10 scripts if you wanted to.
Were these all features or are these shorts
Yeah,
on?
they didn't have TV at all then,
Okay.
which wasn't, I think, not a big deal. I think they should have had TV and they just didn't want to do that because TV wasn't big then. It
Hmm.
wasn't what you were supposed to go into. And I really am grateful to have been there because the 434s, it was their attitude about it was they didn't offer rewrite classes. And once in a while, somebody like I did do one rewrite while I was there, but most people didn't let you do rewrites because they wanted you to get those first 5 bad drafts out of your system. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And one of the scripts I wrote there actually did get made, but the rest of them, one of them got optioned a bunch of times, but one of them got made. And then the rest of them, I don't even remember what they were about. But I'm glad I wrote them, because you just learn so much every time you finish even just a bad draft
Yep.
about what you should and shouldn't do and how you get in touch with your characters, and you start to understand structure. Like, I feel like it really took me, honestly, I feel like teaching structure is actually what reinforced it for me, but reading and writing scripts really, really helped me understand the idea that structure and plot don't mean anything unless they're tied directly to character and your character's choices.
Mm-hmm.
And that's hard to internalize unless you're writing all the time and you're finishing a script. Do you know what I mean? Even if it's just a draft.
I think that's one of the epiphanies that hit me probably right after I finished grad school. And I don't know why it was never mentioned, or maybe I just didn't process it and it was mentioned. But yeah, connecting all your act breaks, all your important beats to character.
Yeah,
It's like so obvious to me now. Like I would never even
exactly.
consider doing something that way. But for years, I'd have act breaks. I had nothing to do with
Well, and
my
that's something
character.
that you still like talked about, but it was, and I could intellectually understand it, but I couldn't quite figure out what it really meant to me and how to do it until I had written a bunch of scripts and started to feel like, oh, now I'm getting it. I mean, it took a long time. Um, and then when what I found interesting is when I got out of grad school, I had won the Samuel Goldwyn. So my then agents who signed me always signed the Goldwyn winner.
Oh,
And
nice.
they, well, it was nice, except, and I loved them, but they were big spec salesmen. And I'm not a big spec writer. I don't think in those ways. I don't come up with those big hooky ideas. It's just, I wish I did. It's just not who I am. And so they would say, well, send us a list of ideas and we'll tell you which one to write. And I was young and I was impressionable, and they were at William Morris, and they were like, one of them was, they were both head of the lit department. One of them was head of the directing department. So I was so impressed, and they were great. I mean, they would answer my phone calls, which was a big deal. And I felt like I had to perform as opposed to it being a collaboration, because I was really impressionable and young. And so they weren't forcing me to do anything. So I chose to do this, but I would send them these ideas and then they would say, oh, write this one. But I never thought about, am I connected to this idea? Or like personal thematic, which I talk about all the time. What's my personal thematic? I had no idea. I just knew, oh, they thought they could sell that idea. I'm going to write that. And then the script would be pretty terrible, or not, if not terrible, then kind of sterile and unattainable, and not, there was no emotion behind it.
Yeah, I always tell
And
my students if there's no connection to it, like you said, you're just writing stuff that happens for no reason.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Can you break down your version of personal thematic?
Sure. I mean, it's something. So I first started thinking about personal thematic at Cinestory, which is that nonprofit that I run, with three other people. And Meg Lefauve was there as a mentor, and she was one of my mentors. And she did this whole personal thematic exercise that's designed to help you figure out why you write, and the fact that everybody has one story to tell. And the way that you tell it, you're always going to boil down to that one story. It's just you're telling it in different iterations every time you tell a story. And that was a revelation, because I was like, oh, so if I come up with an idea, the only way I'm really going to be able to make it sing is if I understand how it connects to my personal thematic, or how I am connected to it, And when you have that really internal draw to what you're writing, stuff really starts to resonate within you. And I know you know this. And then it starts to resonate with other people because they see that there's truth in it.
Yep.
So at
Um,
Cinestory, when Meg would come and she would do this, we started having her do this personal thematic thing with a group. And then when she wasn't able to come regularly, because I mean her career just went nuts, and so she couldn't come regularly. And so I had been to this women's writers residency, and they ask if alumni want to give back and do you want to teach a seminar or something. And I thought, oh, well, why don't I try a personal thematic seminar? But I couldn't, because she had gotten her list of questions from somebody else. And so it was kind of this pass down thing, but I couldn't teach that as to 70 people, because this was an online seminar that I volunteered to teach for Hedgebrook. That's the women's writers residency. So I came up with my own take on personal thematic that I could do for a big group online. And it was super fun to do. It was kind of terrifying, but it was really, really fun. And so we decided, let's do that's a Cinestory. So the very last day of every retreat, whether it's TV or film, people get the exercise ahead of time. And then we break people up into 4 groups with a group leader for each. And we go through what they've come up with as their personal thematic, because they do the exercise separately. When I do it online, I take you through the whole seminar, but we spend 2 or 3 hours going through each person in the informal, going through their personal thematic and talking it through and saying, well, what about this, and helping them expand it and really figure out if it's really their personal thematic, and if it is, well, what else is there to it? And it's so fun to do.
Can you give me some examples of what a personal thematic is?
Sure. I write because I want people to know that no one is truly typical. That's what makes us interesting, human, and worth fighting for. My stories are personal ones about struggling and longing to connect, failing and trying again. They're stories I want to tell so well that other people see themselves in them, whether they're atypical or not. I want them to know that different is normal, valuable, necessary, and very, very human. So that was one that I wrote quite a few years ago. I mean, because I feel like they evolve and change as you evolve and change as a writer. I have another one, but I don't know how polished that one is. But it really is so helpful, because when I wrote that one, it like a light bulb went on for something I was working on, and it really helped me figure out not only what wasn't working, but who the main character was, what her struggles were. It was really incredibly helpful. And so I try and make myself do that exercise. Well, I really only do it every few years, but I should be doing it honestly once a year.
One of the things that it helps me with now, realizing my personal connection to a story, it just cuts out so much excess work that I
Yeah.
was doing in my younger years. I remember I wrote a feature and it just wasn't working and I couldn't figure it out. And, like a year later, it dawned on me that one of the supporting characters, that's the protagonist, not the
Yes.
protagonist that I chose.
It's so interesting, right? You're like, oh, wait a minute, I'm writing about the wrong person.
Right. And it's because I didn't realize what the personal connection to it was. Once I realized that, I'm like, oh, that's the protagonist. Why am I
Yeah.
spending all the time with this one? And, I've had those breakthroughs over the years that just hit you like a ton of bricks, but it's also like, duh, because once you know it, it's just so obvious. But when you're a novice screenwriter, it's not quite that obvious.
No, and I don't even think it's always that obvious. I mean, because I feel like, well, I have one friend who said that he actually doesn't start, and I don't start with thematic necessarily. I mean, I have a really hard time being like, okay, what's the theme of this piece? I have such a hard time with that. But I have to have some sense of what my connection to it is, which is different than what's the theme of the piece. And he'll work backwards, and he'll like just start with the character, start with the plot, and then he'll eventually figure out what the theme is. But for me, it's more about connection than it is about what am I trying to tell people? Do you know what I mean? I mean, that I'll eventually get to, but when I was younger, I couldn't even get that. I was like, okay, what is this? What am I interested in writing about?
Mhm.
Which is helpful to a certain extent, but then you end up with this kind of surface story. But you're
Yeah.
right. I mean, getting to what's my connection and what am I talking about in terms of my connection, that does cut out so much work.
Yeah, I
Um,
always misunderstood the write what you know thing that they teach you in film school because I'm like, oh, I know what it's like to be an Indian kid growing up in the US. And,
yeah.
30 years ago, nobody wanted to see a screenplay like that. Now they're
Now they do.
everywhere.
Yeah, exactly.
But I know what it's like to work at Pizza Hut because I worked at Pizza Hut in high school. And so I would write stories in restaurants and things like that, but
Yeah.
they had no point to them. It wasn't until later that I realized it's write what you've learned, write,
Yeah,
write,
exactly.
write the lessons you've gotten, write about the things where you're talking to a friend who's dealing with something and you tell them a story. That's the core of your story. Make that your
Exactly.
feature film.
Exactly.
And I got to tell you, it made life so much easier in terms of writing, in terms of those aspects of it. It's still hard, but
Okay.
having that
It's never
emotional
easy.
core, yeah. I actually break it down even further. I have my students, um, mine themselves for their stories because at the end of the day, Hollywood's not looking for you to write the next Star Wars. They've got 1,000 professional screenwriters that are lined up to do that. They're looking for you to tell unique voices, unique stories with your voice. And the biggest thing I think a young writer can do is figure out what their voice is.
Yeah, I
And
agree.
so I'm like, look inside yourself for your stories, because that way you're going to write a story only you can write, because you're the only one that's gone through that in that way.
Yeah, well, you're the only one who has that voice, because that is
Exactly.
voice. What
Yeah.
your experiences are your voice, and how you convey that. And I like how you were saying, think about how you would tell a story to a friend.
Mhm.
That's your voice.
That is your voice.
Yeah, that's complete.
Take it even a step further. I designed this, I didn't design it, but I called it the emotional wound. What is your emotional wound? You know, First of all, take it out of yourself and plant it in the ground and water it and grow another person out of it. And that's your antagonist.
Yeah.
They are the
Oh, that's so good. I like that.
physical manifestation of your emotional wound. So when you defeat the antagonist, you heal your emotional wound. And so two things are connected in a way that everything they do is emotional because of the way they were designed.
Love that.
So,
That's really good. I got to remember that.
well, you can check it out in my book.
Oh, you didn't even know you had one. Oh, I need that.
Scriptcake Secrets, the top
Oh,
10
I love
mistakes
that.
novice screenwriters make and how to fix them.
That's great. Oh, I'm so
It's,
reading that.
oh, I appreciate it. And I'll even give you one more, a nugget if you want.
Sure.
Once you know what the emotional wound is, I want you to treat the audience as if they're like doctors who are trying to figure out what sickness somebody has. Okay. Because your protagonist basically has a sickness. And when they're trying to figure it out, they have to look at what the symptoms are. Okay. And then make a nice long list of 10 or 20 symptoms. And each one of those is a scene in your first act.
That's nice.
I'm telling you, it works. And
Oh
then,
my God, I love that.
then you figure out the physical way to tell that in the most entertaining way. And that way your scenes are already layered before you even start, because there's an emotional layer underneath and a physical layer on top, as opposed to just physical stuff happening for no reason.
Yeah, when you just stick to the physical stuff happening, it's just very hollow. It feels very almost aimless.
Yeah.
And what I find so interesting is, so when I had kids, I was shocked to discover I did not want to go be on a set 24/7. And so to make money when they were little, I read for the Nicholl.
Mhm.
And I was reading for Story, and I was helping run Story. And so the Nicholl, I would read 24 scripts a week for like 6 months. Yeah. Oh yeah, it was crazy. And then I was reading for Story too. So in any given year,
These
I
are
did.
features, 24 features a week. I don't think I read that much when I was, teaching 4 or 5 classes simultaneously.
Crazy. And I did this for 5 to 7 years. I would have to look, but like for 5 to 7 years. And in all that time, I really started to learn and it is true. I mean, and everybody who reads a ton of scripts knows this, within the first 5 pages, you pretty much know if it's going to be a well-told story or not, because you can, well, and honestly, sometimes you do, after about 15 pages, you realize, oh, they lost their way, but this is really good.
Mhm.
But that's rare. But you start to realize that the scripts that aren't resonating, or aren't resonating as well as they could, or have lost their way in the second act, it's because they've started to write interlocking scenes that aren't connected by any kind of urgency on the part of the character. So the character's not making choices.
Mhm.
It's that the writer has decided this is what has to happen, and let me get them there with me directing them, as opposed to my character just making choices that are true to who they are.
Yep.
And this is how we started the conversation. It's really interesting to me that I didn't realize that I wasn't doing that in my own screenplays, or I wasn't as aware that I wasn't doing that in my own screenplays until I started reading that much too. It wasn't just having written a ton of stuff. It was also, oh, I got to read all this stuff, and I've got to tell. The Nicholl makes you write like at least a paragraph about why you've scored the script the way you've scored it, whether you've scored it a 0 or 100. You got to let them know why. And so you become very adept at verbalizing why something isn't working. And 9 times out of 10, it was that this isn't character driven. And I truly understood what that meant. It was so incredibly helpful. I would not recommend that somebody do that on a regular basis. But
I can only imagine how helpful that was, because
yeah,
reading the scripts is, it's easy as pie to see what's wrong with it. But
yeah.
pointing that same type of attitude towards your own stuff,
Oh, it's hard.
you don't have that perspective. It's completely different. But one of the things that I always think is interesting is students will write their screenplays, and of course, the protagonist is a thinly veiled version of themselves, and of course, they can do no wrong, so they don't make any bad decisions.
Oh, I love it.
They just deal with everybody else's nonsense, and I'm like, that's not how it works.
No, it's not how it works at all. And you got to be mean to your characters. My sister's a writer to my twin. She's a fiction writer, and she was at a reading one night. She was reading, and there were 4 women up there, and they'd each read their pieces, and it was a Q&A afterwards. And Colette made some comment about how she's as mean as possible to her characters, especially the one she loves the most, because you have to be. I mean, like, that's where you're going to get a story. You have to present them with obstacles that are cruel. And this woman in the audience started berating her about, how could you do that? I would never do that to my characters. And I mean, it was brutal. And eventually that conversation ended because the moderator was like, okay, let's move on. But afterwards, a bunch of us were writers that were in the audience, and we all got together and started talking. We all said, we don't think she's a good writer. We would lay bets that woman that was berating Colette is probably a terrible writer, because if she's not mean to her characters, what the hell's going on in her stories?
What are they doing? Yeah, they just can't seem to be mean to themselves and separate that. So
Yeah.
that's a common thing. But tell me how you went from this into being involved with Cinestory.
I applied. It was 22 years ago on the nose, because the first thing I ever went to, the first retreat I ever went to, I was 6 months pregnant with my oldest kid. And I got in, and it was a phenomenal experience. And Pam was so great, the woman who created Cinestory. I was told I couldn't drive up the mountain, so she had somebody drive me up the mountain and drive me home.
Wow.
So she made it super easy for me to go. And it was just such a magical experience in so many ways. When you sit down with these people who read your work and they're giving you notes. And that was actually the first time Meg was ever one of my mentors. And she actually couldn't make it to the retreat, I remember. And so she had me come to her office, and I was there for 3 hours, because she was I mean, her notes are amazing.
Wow.
So when they had an alumni retreat, I went, and that was in Idlewild. That was the first time they did it in Idlewild, and that was a great experience. And then I took a few years off, and my friend Willie, who's still one of my closest friends to this day, we went to grad school together. He had won Cinestory after I'd gone the second time, and he started volunteering. And so he found out that I had gone, and he said, well, why don't you volunteer with me? And I called Pam, and she said, of course. And so that was it. I just never stopped going. I started volunteering, and then we formed a board, and they were looking. It's just, one thing led to another, and I just never left. And I just kept taking on more responsibility, and then pulling people in to come in. Like, my sister is now the executive director there, and much to her chagrin. But
Well,
it's
I had a great experience. I went to the Squaw Valley Writers
I
Retreat.
did too.
You did?
Yeah, I
Yeah,
went years ago. I forget when I went, but yeah,
yeah, I went years ago. That's back. I think they still had a screenwriter section back then. I don't
they
know if they
did. I
do
went
that.
then too.
Yeah, and it was such a phenomenal, just it's like a vacation with a whole bunch of people who are interested in the same thing that you're interested in.
Yep.
It was really amazing. And you meet these amazing writers and these mentors and whatnot. So can you tell me, what is the competitions that you offer, and how does it work if you get to go to the retreats, and how do you get into that?
So you apply to either fellowship, and we run them at different times of the year. So the feature fellowship, that competition, I forget when that competition starts, but it culminates. We're now reading semifinalists, and then the retreat is in the beginning of October, October 7th through the 10th. And so if you make it into the semifinals, you automatically get an invitation to come to the feature retreat. And this is true of the TV retreat as well, but the TV retreat's in the spring. And I believe we open the TV retreat right around when we have the feature retreat. And so it's the same steps. If you for both of them, if you make it to the semifinals, you definitely get an invitation. If you make it into the quarterfinals, you can put yourself on the wait list as soon as we release the invitation to the semifinalists. And it used to be that, we really worked hard to fill those retreat spots, and now we have waiting lists, which is fantastic. And it used to be you'd have, what do we have, 16, 20 writers, and we'd have maybe 16 to 22 mentors. And now we have 35 to 36 writers, not including teams, but entities, and then 35 mentors. I mean, it's really grown. And then we have like 10 staffers that come and work, 10 or 8 or 10. We have interns that come. It's really, really grown. So now instead of being like, a 35-person retreat, it's a 80 to 90-person retreat. And it's fun. It's still the same vibe. So you do get that invite. And if you're a finalist, you definitely, and you have the choice not to come. We now offer scholarships, which we're really happy to be able to do. So if you make it into the semifinals, you can apply for a scholarship. They're not, most of them now I think are full. I can't remember if they're full on. I don't have my paperwork in front of me because we shift every year. And then once you get in, if you get a spot in the retreat, we have you send your work in a month in advance, and then we pair, like literally I start recruiting every year. Well, I think I'm year-round recruiting, quite honestly, for both retreats. And the head of the TV retreat or the head of the feature retreat will sit down about when we get everybody's materials, and we'll literally go through and we very carefully pair people. So we find out from the mentors ahead of time what they most enjoy reading and what they absolutely don't read. So if they don't read horror, they don't get a horror script. If they don't read sci-fi, they don't get a sci-fi script. We want to make sure it's as good an experience as possible. And then the mentors have 3 weeks to read all the materials before they get there. And meanwhile, the writers have to prepare for the retreat before they even get there, because we have exercises that we want them to do. So we have something called fly on the wall. So you come in with a 3-minute pitch and you sit down, and you've got the other writers in your group, because we split people into smaller groups, so everybody gets a chance to do this. So on Fly on the Wall, you sit down and you've got between 2 and 6, well, probably 2 and 5 mentors, and you're pitching to them as if they're execs, and they get to decide. The mentors decide ahead of time what execs they are, and then you pitch, they ask a few questions, and then you leave the room, but really you're still sitting there, and then they talk about your pitch as if you weren't there, so that you get an idea of what people are going to be saying when you leave the room. And of course, they're never horrible. I mean, we don't want them to destroy people, but we want them to give writers a distinct, not a distinct, but an honest impression of what they could have worked on. We do, what are some of the new ones we do? We do something called.
Let me just talk about that. How valuable is that?
Yeah.
To be
No,
able
and
to
it's
hear
terrifying.
that. Yes. I used to teach a producing class at the North Carolina School of the Arts, my
Yeah.
alma mater, and I would bring in 3 or 4 working professionals, and I would force my students to pitch them. And I mean, they're pooping their pants. They're just freaked out about this whole
Yeah,
thing.
it's scary.
But better that happen in a controlled environment like a retreat or a school than the
Exactly.
first time you face it is out in LA somewhere, because
Oh my
that's
God.
daunting. I've been through that. It's not, it's scary.
I lose sleep over when I have to pitch. I mean, it's hard. I mean, it's gotten better as I've gotten older, but it's really hard. I mean, it's not easy. And I think it's easier to do it when you're doing it online now, but you still got to do it in person. I mean, and you still have to do it even if you're on Zoom, you're still pitching to people. So
But to
it's
be able
really
to listen,
valuable.
but to be able to listen to their thoughts of it afterwards,
It's
that
really helpful.
also is fantastic, because they
And
can write notes for you, but it's not the same as hearing it and maybe possibly having a conversation about it.
no, exactly. I mean, it's really, really great. And so that's something they have to prepare for. They have to prepare their personal thematic. Oh, and then we have now we're separating it out. We do a log line exercise. We do a pitch. Now we're separating it. It used to be log lines and pitches, because we want you to be able to feel more comfortable before you do Fly on the Wall. So we're trying out different things. And that's something that we really feel strongly about, is we're trying to, because we have so many repeat, like our alum come back a lot. They reapply, and very often we'll make it to the retreat again. So what we're trying to do is create programming that they don't have to repeat. So some of them, they always have to do like we always have retreat etiquette. That's what starts the retreat. First thing in the morning, Saturday morning, you're there. We're like, this is what you got to do to get the most out of this retreat. And we don't care if you've been there 5 times. But then, for example, if somebody's taken, what's one that we do all the time? If you've heard, for example, if you've gone to the character informal over and over and over again. Well, this year we did building your brand instead for alumni, and people who hadn't had character went to character. So, and this year we're developing new exercises for people to do. That one of them is going to be, I forget what we decided we would call it, but it's all about developing characters and dialogue. And we wanted to make it an exercise because what you and I both know is, having taught, is that people learn more from actually writing this stuff down and making it a creative exercise where you're actually doing what it is we intend you to do. And so we're trying to always come up with new things for people to do, or at least at the very least improve the exercises we already have, and then have informals that are our mainstay. Like this year we can't do this because we can't have managers come to the retreat because of the strike, but usually we have a manager panel and we try to talk about the the nitty-gritty of that and what it is to work with a manager for real. So we're always expanding and growing that part of it and trying to make it as interesting as possible. It's exhausting though, because literally we want those writers to be there if they're not in their one-on-one, because really when they come to the retreat, they get 3 mentors that have read their work, and then they sit down, hopefully on 3 different days. Sometimes you'll have this meeting on the same day. You sit down with your individual mentors and it's just the 2 of you, and for an hour and a half you get notes in your script. And if you run out of time, you run out of time, but if you don't, you have some time left over, then you can ask questions about the industry, you can talk about where you want your career to go and get advice. They're really valuable, but then you got to go to these informals. Like you don't really get much time to relax. It's exhausting. And then at night, we all have meals together too. That's something that we feel really strongly about. We provide good food. I'm Italian. I can't help it. I have to feed them. And we want everybody to eat together because it's an even playing field. It's not about, oh, I can't go sit with you, you're a producer. I can't go sit with you, you're a professional writer. It's like everybody just sits and talks and has fun. And afterwards we have a game that we play that we all love, that not everybody plays, but it's super fun, and that we play at every retreat. Or people will play the piano and sing, or just sit and talk until 2 in the morning. I mean, it's like Squaw Valley. It's camp for adults with screenwriting, and
That's
it's really fun.
awesome. How long do the retreats usually last for?
They start on a Friday, they end on a Tuesday. So the writers have to come up Friday night, and we have stuff that we have them do Friday night. It used to be we'd have them come, they had to be there Saturday morning. And if they came up the night before, that was easier for them. But now we actually have stuff we want them to do. And then it's midday to Tuesday that people leave. And the mentors come and go as they can, because we can't expect them to be there for the whole time.
Right.
Yeah.
That sounds phenomenal.
It's so much fun.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
want to come.
I want you to come. It'd be great. That'd be so much fun.
So, what kind of scripts get into something like this? Like, is there something that you're looking for? Is it just a broad spectrum? Like, what is it?
It's a broad spectrum. I mean, because I would say there's a type of script that we love in terms of our taste, but really what we're looking for is strong writing. And it's rare, but it's happened where there was one winner years ago, wonderful guy, I loved him. It was his first script ever. That is the only time I know of that happening. And it was a great script. It was a great script. You don't have to have the most polished script in the world for people to respond to it. So if you've got that emotional heft, if there are some problems with us, that doesn't mean you're not going to get through to the next round. I mean, if it completely falls apart, then you might get some great notes. We don't give out notes. We don't require the judges to do notes at this point, that are extensive, but so you're not necessarily going to know this, but if it falls apart completely, then it's probably not going to make it through to any round. But if there are sections where that sag a little bit, or it's a little bit wordy or whatever, if you have a good story and a character that's being told through a character's point of view in a strong way, chances are it will get through. And that can be sci-fi, that can be fantasy, that can be horror. I actually have learned to love horror, having read for screenplay competitions for so long. It can be anything so long as it's well told. And that seems so, it kind of seems like a cop-out, but it's not. It's really, you end up with a well-told story, particularly if you vet it through people and you get responses from people and you hear what's working and what's not working and you keep working on it. You know what I mean? And so that's what I would say to people in terms of what are screenplay competitions looking for, any of them. They're looking for a story well told. And you get to that place by continuing to have people read it and get feedback, and then weeding out the notes that aren't telling the story you want to tell and incorporating the ones that are helping and build the story you want to tell.
Yeah, one of the worst notes I hate getting is when someone's like, well, this is what I would do.
Oh
And,
my God.
and I'm like, well, that's great, but you're not doing it. I'm doing it. So
Exactly.
let's focus on
Exactly.
what I'm trying to do.
And the thing is, I don't mind when somebody says to me, well, what about this?
I love
Because
that.
that's leaving it open. That's leaving it like you're not telling the writer, you got to do it this way. Like recently, somebody said to me, well, you have to do it this way. And I was like, I really don't. You can't write it this way. You have to do it this way. And I was like, do I though? The really helpful notes, and that's also, I think, a matter of experience where you start to learn, because even difficult notes to hear, actually the most difficult notes to hear are usually the ones that you have to lean into. But the ones that are overly prescriptive are the ones that I generally say, I'll look at that, but not as closely as I would to something that is reflecting, not even reflecting, taking into account what I'm trying to do.
Mhm.
Very often people, when they say you have to do it this way, aren't looking or even asking about what your intentions are with your story. And I think that's really important when you're getting notes from someone, is that they are inquisitive enough to say, what are you trying to do here? This is the impression I'm getting. Is that what you're trying to accomplish?
It's a skill set in and of itself, just being able to know what notes to listen to and what notes not to
Yeah,
listen to.
absolutely.
And that just comes with time, I think. That comes with experience, and that comes with, making some mistakes along the way.
Well, it's interesting. One of the things that we've learned, and this was when I was first volunteering at Cinestory, the mentors were starting to say, well, our writers don't know how to take notes from us. Like they're really like either there's resistance or they're mystified, and they're not navigating the retreat well. So that's when we started doing this like morning prep where we would say, now we do it, I think the night before, um, where we say to people, okay, this is what we want you to listen for in terms of notes. And if you're not getting it, then ask these questions here. And, some people are like, well, we've heard this before, but I feel like you can never hear that enough. And if you're coming to a retreat, you're going to have to hear it again, even if you're an alumni. How do you ask? How do you take notes? And then how do you give notes? Because if you know how to give them, you're going to recognize what a good note is when you're getting it. And you're going to recognize a bad note when you're getting it because you know how to do it. And you know when you're giving a bad note, you know?
That's one of the things I loved about some of my grad courses is that, we would all have to do like 10 pages a week, but we would also have to read everyone else's work while we were
Exactly.
doing it. Yeah. And you get just as much from that as you do from getting notes on your own stuff.
I agree. I
Yeah.
agree.
All
Well,
right.
and you might, I have a feeling you feel this way too. When I started teaching and I had to verbalize what I knew, that helped me a lot too, because all of a sudden I was like, oh, I have to have this actually make sense for other people, which means I have to like encode it in my own brain in a way that makes sense to
Yeah.
me too.
And
And that was really helpful.
yeah, you build up a library of that stuff too. So you can just tap into it in the future because you're just
Exactly.
seeing the same patterns over and over with your students over time. There's no doubt about that. So, as a screenwriting instructor, what are the biggest two or three things that you think, writers working their way up really need to focus on and work out? What are those things you see all the time over and over and over again?
One of the things that I always say, and it's not even what I see, it's what I tell people to do. And actually at UCLA, when I used to teach at UCLA, the professional program, they would have everybody give like their final words of wisdom at the graduation ceremony. And I would always say, you have to give yourself permission to write shit. You
Mhm.
just do. Because if you're not willing to write imperfectly, you're never going to get to the end,
Mhm.
ever. You're not going to get to the end, and you're not going to get that great lesson of seeing something that you've started out with this little tiny germ of an idea. You're not going to see it as a whole picture and an imperfect picture, but still the picture, so that you can go in and start that rewrite. How do you rewrite if there's nothing finished?
There's a book by Anne Lamott called Bird by
I
Bird,
love that book.
and one of the chapters is called Writing Shitty First Drafts.
Oh, I forgot about that.
And that was where the same note that you're giving hit me, and and she says, the whole point of writing a first draft is for it to be shitty.
Uh-huh.
If you're
Exactly.
attempting to do anything beyond that, you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. And it was like this light bulb went off because I'm like, I can write a shitty first draft because that's what I've been doing
I
for
can do
years.
that. I can do that. And you're like, wow, I have a skill set. I can write a shitty first draft.
Exactly right. So now I look at the first draft as the equivalent of generating a lump of clay. That's all
Oh,
I'm
I like
trying
that.
to do. And then with my rewrites, I start shaping that lump of clay into the beautiful thing that I hope that it will be. And
Yeah.
so I, I hope writers take this to heart. It is such a release of pressure and stress if you just allow yourself to write a shitty first draft.
Exactly. It's huge. And the thing about a shitty first draft, and this is actually advice that I got in Rob Long, the guy that I mentioned earlier that I went to college with. So he had gone on to write for Cheers and he wrote for all these other TV shows. And then he was teaching at UCLA to give back. And so I had him in grad school. And one of the first days of class, he said, I don't care if your main character is green on page 5 and then becomes purple on page 45. Do not go back and rewrite all of those pages to reflect that change. He said, because by the time you get to the end of the script, your character may not even be human. You know, you want to see where that character is going to go by the end of the script and then think about rewriting. But if you're always reworking those first 45 pages, not only are you just going to be beating a dead horse, you're not giving yourself room to explore who these people want to become, because they do take on a life of their own in our own brains. It's something I think after a while it becomes second nature to release them to a certain extent. And sometimes it's not. I mean, sometimes it's really hard to release those characters to do what they want to do. But when they are doing what they want to do, that's a magical feeling.
Absolutely. I harp on it over and over again. I'll have somebody who'll work on the same 10 pages like 20 times.
God,
I'm
yeah,
like, you could have written 2 features by now. You could
exactly.
have written 200 pages basically, and you're still stuck on page 10. And, one of the things that for me, I don't know if other writers are this way, I already know that 90% of my first act is going to get rewritten anyways, because in my second act and third act, my discovery, I'm going to realize all this stuff has to be set up.
Exactly. Exactly. You're gonna have all these new discoveries that weren't in your outline. And we're
Right.
talking screenwriting. You write it, most people write a detailed outline.
Yep.
It's gonna
And,
change.
and so I always tell my students screenplays actually get written backwards. You
Yeah.
write you write a first act, so you can write kind of your second act, so you can write the third act. And then you go back and fix the first and second act, and you change 90% of the first one and probably 50% of the second one, and maybe 20 or 30% of the third one. But in general, those percentages are pretty accurate, I've seen over the years.
Yeah. It's interesting, right? And something else that I tell people is when you do finish the script, first of all, put it away.
Yep.
Just don't touch it for a week. But second of all, if you're going to rewrite it, start with an outline what you actually have. Not what you had before, not what the old outline was, but outline what you actually have. And look at that first and see, because that's going to tell you much more easily where your holes are. Sure, you can go in and you can, and you're going to know. I mean, quite honestly, that's not true. If I really, because I tend to write long. So a lot of times if I have a draft, I'll go in and I'll cut out a lot of the chuffa, a lot of the stuff that I know is going to go, and just so I have a better idea of the outline. But really, I think it's invaluable to sit down and just outline what you've got, look at that outline and see what it is you need to do structurally. See if your character is making choices at those turning points.
Mm-hmm.
See if you've got a B story. See if, just see what you have in the rough draft. And honestly, always refer to it as a vomit draft, because that is what it is. It is a vomit draft.
Love that you're saying that, because I think the biggest and most difficult thing to do after writing a first draft is to get perspective on it,
Yes.
because I think you're in the story. And if we can somehow put it on a wall and outline it, or on a piece of paper or in a computer, and see it at arm's length and look at it with perspective, that's such an important thing. I have a bunch of technical exercises I make writers do after their first draft. Just all I'm really trying to do is distance them from it,
Yep.
so
It's
that they
smart.
can actually look at it clearly, as opposed to with love goggles, which is how we look at our own writing. We love it so much, it's so hard to tweak and
No,
change
I
it.
do.
Yeah.
Not those vomit drafts.
Not those drafts. All right, well, give me one more, because we're coming up on our hour here, so give me one
Right.
more note that you would give.
Oh, this is something I always see. Be prepared to chop off the top and the bottom of almost every scene. I
Mm,
don't want to hear a hello. I
mhm,
don't want to hear a goodbye. I want that every line of dialogue to count. So once you've gotten to, let's say, your true first draft, and you know what your story's about, and you've gotten a good outline, and you've rewritten according to that outline, look at those scenes and make sure that you're starting and ending in the right place. Because 9 times out of 10, new screenwriters are starting way too early and they're getting out way too late.
mhm,
And they're not necessarily looking at whether or not they're writing towards the conflict of the scene, what the central conflict of each scene is. I mean, there's a central conflict of the story, and there's a conflict in each scene where people, they have to want different things, and that's where the conflict comes from. And so often it's easy to lose the conflict because you are starting too early and getting out too late.
absolutely.
So I think that's a really, really important thing to consider when you're writing your next draft
Yeah, that's one of the
or
things
any draft.
when you're writing a scene based upon a symptom comes in handy. Because I feel like most of the time they don't know why they're writing a scene.
And then you have to know why. You have to
Yeah,
know how it's pushing the story forward.
right. And you need to know what is the point of this scene
Yep.
emotionally, subtextually, before you write the physical. Oftentimes I'll have people write a physical story and then try to go at the beginning of the movie, and then oh, it's about the father and daughter's, real relationship. But the middle 88 pages don't have anything to do with
Oh
that.
my God. Yeah. And you're like, that's not working.
Yeah, no, kind of every scene has to do with that. And
Which doesn't mean it has to be them in every scene, but it means
right.
that even an internal choice that's being made by one of the characters that changes something about them, it doesn't have to be this big external thing. But if you can change it so that it's if you can show that change in, that internal change in a visual way, then you've got a scene. That's
Yeah,
another one last thing. Write visually. Remember that you are writing for a visual medium. So if you tell me something that's going on internally that I can't see on screen, great that you've told me that, but how are you going to translate that up there? Because the more you do that, the less likely it is that what you're actually writing is going to make it to the screen,
yeah,
because somebody else is going to rewrite that so that it's visual, and it's going to be their visual, not yours.
yeah. The way I tell them to do it is find out what that emotional beat is, figure out what the conflict is that reveals that emotional beat, write that visual scene. And if you have to add some dialogue in there on top of it, that's fine. But dialogue are just sprinkles on the
It
script.
is, yeah.
That's all it is. And
Pull it
um,
all out if you have to. I tell people to pull all of their do at least one pass where you pull all of the dialogue out and you read it to see how it reads, and if there's a story there. And it makes a big difference.
I bet it does. I bet it does. Well, Lisanne, thank you so much
Well, thank you for having
for
me.
taking the time and talking to me. I know we've had to reschedule this a few times because we've had some crazy schedules between the two of us.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you happen to know when the next deadline is for Cine Stories?
So our next deadline for the TV retreat is September 4th. That's our regular deadline. Our late deadline is October 1st. And then we have an extended and a final that are November, December. And you can always find all that stuff on cinestory.org.
Okay. And
And people can
when will
always email me with questions too, by the way, at Lisanne at cinestory.org. They're welcome to email me with questions, and I'm fine with that.
awesome. Well, once again, thank you so much. It's been enlightening, and I look forward to the next time we chat.
Definitely. So much fun.
All
Thanks,
right.
Livin. This is great.
Until next time.